In the dark corners of the Stalker universe, secrets are abound. Artifacts are prized. Emissions are feared. In every faction, from duty to freedom, fights to claim their vision of the zone's future. But what if there was another faction left on the cutting room floor? A hidden congregation known only by half-whispered tales and alpha builds, dusty design documents, and the imaginations of modders. Tonight, we step across the boundary of official lore into the realm of speculation and ask, how would the elusive Sin faction, sometime called the Apostles or Dark Stalkers, have changed the story of the Zone forever? Sin has always been the ghost at the edges of the Stalker lore. Unlike the widespread rumor mill that once surrounded Monolith or Duty, Sin's presence is fleeting, more rumor than documented fact. Yet, a handful of alpha build files, leftover text strings, and concept art reveal that GSE Game World at least toyed with the idea of a darker cult. These references paint Sin as a twisted, clandestine group whose agenda could have forever altered our understanding of the Zone. We see glimpses of them in the early versions of Shadow of Chernobyl, dialogue referenced to hooded figures lurking near hidden laboratories, or half-finished faction icons labeled Sin in the game files. Later, in community mods like Lost Alpha and others, fans breathed life into these cryptic references. They gave the Sin faction distinctive black cloaks, silent weaponry, and a terrifying devotion to the Zone's darker energies. But if GSE had fully realized Sin within the official lore, one question remains. How would it have impacted the world that we know? If you haven't already, consider subscribing, as only 6.6% of the people watching have. Thank you. The official Stalker games introduce us to Monolith, arguably the most fanatical faction in the Zone. But what if Sin was even more frightening? Some design notes and fan theories suggest that Sin might have been a separate sect, a group of self-proclaimed apostles who consciously chose to revere the Zone as a godlike entity. Unlike Monolith, who are controlled through psychic manipulation emanating from the sea consciousness, Sin's devotion would have been more akin to a purposeful, religious zeal. They wouldn't need the brain scorcher to coax their loyalty. They would worship the Zone of their own free will. In this alternate history, Sin's belief system might revolve around the concept of the Zone as a living organism, an evolving consciousness, punishing humanity for its hubris. They would view anomalies and artifacts not merely as scientific curiosities or profit sources, but as sacred manifestations of the living Zone's will. This sense of reverence would push them to commit radical acts, kidnappings for living sacrifices, infiltration into other factions to sabotage those who exploit the Zone, and even the co-opting of labs like X-18 or X-16 to attempt monstrous rituals intended to commune with the Zone's essence. At the heart of Sin's dogma lies a dual concept, fear and obedience. The members of Sin, in a completed version of this lore, would believe that the Zone must be both appeased and feared. Their whispered mantras would revolve around the idea that every emission is a form of the Zone's wrath, a cosmic sign that humanity is unworthy to dwell there. In their twisted perspective, the only way to avoid ultimate destruction would be to show absolute deference to the Zone through dark rituals, artifact offerings, and self-sacrifice. To outsiders, this ideology would be horrifying. Even Monolith's zeal is somewhat explained by psychic control, but Sin, they would be truly voluntary in their devotion. Their ranks would be filled with bitter ex-mercenaries seeking atonement for sins they believe caused the Zone expansion, or traumatized stalkers who suffered personal losses from emissions and cling to a new creed to survive mentally. This psychological dimension alone would add an entirely new layer of horror to the Stalker narrative. In the existing original trilogy, that being Shadow of Chernobyl, Clear Sky, and Call of Pripyat, each faction sees the Zone through a distinct lens. Duty aims to eradicate it, Freedom wants to live in harmony with it, ecologists study it, and monoliths worship it under the Brain Scorcher's thrall. Insert Sin into this tapestry, and suddenly you have a silent, creeping threat that respects no alliances and no laws. Duty, for instance, is staunchly anti-Zone, so Sin would view them as blasphemers who must be purged to appease the Zone's anger. Freedom might mistakenly think Sin as an ally at first, only to discover that Sin's version of embracing the zone includes heinous rituals that even Freedom could never condone. Even Monolith, ironically, would clash with Sin. Though both are often described as cult-like, the root of Monolith's fanaticism lies in an external psychic influence, while Sin's devotion would come from their own twisted convictions. In a scenario where these two factions meet, we'd see an unholy collision of faith versus mind control. Imagine the spectacle of hooded Sin zealots squaring off against glassy-eyed Monolith soldiers in the dead city of Pripyat, both believing they are the zone's true servants. Let's step through each of the main Stalker titles and ask ourselves how Sin might have changed the course of events. In Shadow of Chernobyl, the Marked One hunts for S.T.A.L.K.E.R, crossing paths with duty, freedom, and eventually topples the psychic stronghold in the north. If Sin had existed, perhaps the Marked One would occasionally stumble upon cryptic messages scrawled in blood, or discover entire squads of stalkers sacrificed in bizarre altars. The final trek into the heart of the zone might even reveal that Sin was quietly orchestrating certain events, hoping to harness the Wish Granter for a truly catastrophic ritual. In Clear Sky, where the zone experiences catastrophic expansions, Sin could emerge as a hidden hand behind the destabilization. While Clear Sky aims to research and contain the zone's anomalies, Sin might sabotage them from the shadows. Their ultimate goal could be to provoke more emissions, believing each one to be a sign of the zone's ascendancy. Imagine the final showdown at the power plant overshadowed by not just the chaos of an all-out blowout, but also a twisted ceremony performed by Sin to crown the zone in destructive glory. In Stalker canon, artifacts are prized for their anomalous properties, healing, protection, financial windfalls. But from Sin's point of view, these artifacts would potentially be holy relics. If artifacts are gifts from the zone, how does one revere them? Possibly by harnessing them not for profit, but to build dangerously experimental contraptions. Tech-savvy Sin members might fuse artifacts into improvised devices, a tear of the zone that channels emission energy into lethal psychic blasts, or an artifact array that intensifies local anomalies to create inescapable death traps. This obsession could inevitably bring Sin into conflict with all other factions who see artifacts as resources or contraband. The ecologist might attempt to study Sin's contraptions, only to be abducted for being unworthy of the zone's mysteries. Duty forces might raid a Sin hideout, discovering grotesque experiments, horrifically mutated animals, or even captured stalkers wired into living anomaly reactors. Such macabre scenarios would make the zone even darker and morally complex than it already is. From a gameplay perspective, Sin's presence would introduce a new kind of enemy encounter. Unlike bandits who prefer ambushes for loot, or Monolith who swarm areas in militaristic formations, Sin could rely on stealth and psychological warfare. A player might be exploring an abandoned village at twilight, only to see faint torchlight dancing through broken windows, accompanied by low chanting. Creeping closer, you realize these robed figures have set up some occult circle around a swirling anomaly. Are they trying to feed it? Summon something? Or maybe they're just draining the anomaly's power into an artifact for an unknown purpose. Combat with Sin might feel more psychological. They would excel at setting traps, laying down odd totems or artifact-laced trip mines that create mini-emissions when triggered. Their signature weaponry could be heavily modified with silencers and strange ammo types. There might even be rumors of Sin using psychotropic substances gleaned from rare artifacts to dull the pain of radiation, or even heighten their reflexes to inhuman levels. Facing them could be less about a fair fight and more about surviving an encounter that borders on supernatural. In Call of Pripyat, the story focuses on the Major's mission to investigate the crashed helicopters and the deeper reasons behind the failures of Operation Fairway. Now, consider a scenario where the reclusive Sin faction had purposely sabotaged these military efforts, not just out of hostility toward the government, but as a part of a grand ritual to cleanse the zone of foreign influence. Even the mercenaries in Pripyat might be perplexed at how their carefully planned raids fall apart under mysterious circumstances, their men going missing or entire squads found arranged in macabre ritual patterns. Moreover, the presence of Sin would add layers to the storyline about the zone's expansions. In official lore, we learn that the zone is unpredictable, shaped by anomalies and influenced by hidden labs. But with Sin actively agitating the zone, perhaps even feeding it with living or artifact sacrifices, the phenomenon of the zone's self-defense might escalate. Emissions could become more frequent, anomalies more lethal, and entire new areas might open up or shift unpredictably, aligning with Sin's plan to merge with or surrender to the zone's will. One of the greatest missed opportunities for official Stalker lore is the possibility of in-depth side quests that explore the zone's more esoteric corners. The Sin faction would be perfect to handle these. Imagine stumbling upon a hidden underground shrine where battered notebooks outline the cryptic theology of the Eternal Zone. The text might mention an artifact of confluence, rumored to be able to call forth a localized emission. A quest could revolve around preventing Sin from unleashing it in a populated area, or perhaps exploiting it yourself for some ethically questionable gains. These side quests wouldn't just be about new loot, they would delve into the psychological horror, moral dilemmas, and the cosmic unknown. Perhaps a Sin defector offers to help you sabotage a ritual in exchange for safe passage out of the zone. But in the process, you learn that the defector has done unspeakable things in Sin's name, leaving you torn over whether to trust them or hand them over to duty for justice. These narrative wrinkles are precisely what make S.T.A.L.K.E.R so beloved. Life or death choices overshadowed by personal guilt, desperation, and the haunting knowledge that the zone itself might be watching. One especially intriguing angle is how the zone itself might react as Sin. In S.T.A.L.K.E.R lore, the zone is not just a static stage, it is often depicted as having some level of sentience, or at least an uncanny ability to retaliate against perceived threats. If Sin's borderline worship edges too close to disturbing the zone's natural order, you could see the zone push back with freak storms, mutated spore clouds, or violently shifting anomalies. Alternatively, perhaps the zone accepts the Sin's offerings, allowing them to develop new bizarre abilities, like partial immunity to certain anomalies, or a heightened sixth sense for artifacts. This synergy could tilt the entire power dynamic of the zone's ecosystem. And from the player's perspective, discovering that the zone might be rewarding Sin or even acknowledging them would set off alarm bells. Is the zone alive in ways never before confirmed? Do we risk letting these zealots unify and push the boundaries of the zone's power even further, potentially threatening the entire region, if not the world? This existential threat would cast an entirely new shadow across the storyline, shaking up the old dynamics of factions squabbling over territory and artifacts. In the official S.T.A.L.K.E.R canon, the Sin faction remains a curious footnote, a relic of development that never fully materialized. Yet, through the thought experiment of what if Sin was canon, it opens up endless possibilities. From terrifying cult rituals and advanced artifact engineering, to psychological warfare and a brand new angle on worshipping the zone, Sin could have fundamentally reshaped the stories we know and love. They stand as a testament to the unexplored potential within the S.T.A.L.K.E.R series, reminding us that for every known terror in the zone, there are a dozen more lurking in the shadows, waiting to be discovered, or worse yet, awakened. Perhaps GSC will revive some version of these lost heretics, or maybe they'll remain in our imaginations, haunting us like so many of the zone's unexplained phenomena. One thing's for certain, the truth behind Sin, if ever unleashed, would be more disturbing than any emission. After all, in the zone, fear is a currency, and those who master it might just become gods. Thank you all once again for tuning in for a video, and if you haven't already, please drop a comment, like, and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next one.